So, we've just talked about how nitrogen flows through living and non living parts of the environment in some detail, and we've looked at the carbon cycle as well. We still need to look at the biogeochemical cycles of two additional elements that are crucial for living organisms, and those are sulfur and phosphorus. However, the good news is that the level of detail that we go into here is going to be far less than either the nitrogen cycle or the carbon cycle. But we do need to look at these elements because um, phosphorus is a major component of DNA and cell membranes, and sulfur is an important part of proteins. And without either of them, life could not go on. So we need to look at them with respect to how they flow in and out of living things. So let's talk first about sulfur. The element sulfur is found naturally in rocks and minerals. And here on the left, you can see yellow colored sulfur deposits on a rock formation in Lassen Volcanic National Park in California. Through the natural weathering of these rocks and through erosion, sulfur gets released into soil and water. And once in the soil and water, the sulfur gets converted into the form of sulfate ions, or SO4 with a negative electric charge, through a variety of biochemical and geochemical processes. Another form of sulfur, gaseous sulfur dioxide, or SO2, is also emitted into the environment, not through the erosion of rocks, but by volcanic eruptions, as well as the combustion of fossil fuels. Sulfate, remember, sulfate is SO4 with negative charge, in the soil and in the water can be absorbed by plants and microorganisms and incorporated into their biological molecules. And then animals get their sulfur by eating those plants or by eating other animals. So sulfur makes its way up the food chain just like carbon and nitrogen do. And when those organisms die, decomposers in the soil break down their sulfur and release it back into soil and water, which is, of course, a common theme in these biogeochemical cycles. But there's also another process wherein certain types of bacteria in the soil, called sulfate reducing bacteria, will use sulfate as an oxygen substitute when oxygen is not available. Much like denitrifying bacteria will use nitrate as an oxygen substitute in the nitrogen cycle. They will pile electrons onto sulfate and effectively reduce it, which is why this process is called sulfate reduction, and then turn it into a molecule called hydrogen sulfide, H2S, which you can see in the bottom of those two highlighted boxes here. And then other types of soil bacteria can use that hydrogen sulfide as an energy source in a similar way that you would use carbohydrates as an energy source. And when they do, they oxidize it back to sulfate. So these specialized soil bacteria have their own cycle within the cycle. And then, of course, there is also sulfur entering biological systems through unnatural sources, such as through chemically synthesized fertilizers, because sulfate is another very common fertilizer that's used on crops, as well as through the burning of fossil fuels, which put sulfur dioxide gas into the air just like volcanoes do. And that gas actually enters the water cycle, combining with water vapor in the atmosphere and turning into sulfurous acid, which can lead to acid rain. And while you'll often hear in this class about how certain environmental threats are getting worse, I'm happy to be able to report that when it comes to acid rain, the situation has been getting better in the United States. So the figure on the left shows rates of acid rain occurrence between 1989 and 1991, where darker red means more occurrence of acid rain. And the figure on the right shows the same between 2019 and 2021. So it's no surprise that rates of acid rain used to be quite high in regions that were associated with industrial manufacturing and power generation, especially coal burning power plants. And the dramatic improvement that you see here is attributable to a special part of the Clean Air Act called the Acid Rain Program, which was put in place by the US Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, in 1995. And what the Acid Rain Program was, it was a program that set a limit on the amount of sulfur dioxide that power plants were allowed to emit. And it also established a cap and trade system where plants that were reducing their emissions even lower could sell their positive credits to other plants. So, to put in perspective how much things have changed, the final cap that was set in 2010 was half of the sulfur dioxide emission levels that were taking place 30 years prior, in the year 1980. So, this particular case has been a huge success story with respect to environmental regulation and improving environmental and health conditions for humans and nature in areas that were previously plagued by high levels of acid rain. Now, moving on to the phosphorus cycle bears some significant similarities to the sulfur cycle. So, like sulfur, phosphorus is found naturally in rocks and minerals, and it is released into the soil and water through weathering and erosion. And in the water and soil, it exists in an ionic form called phosphate, PO4 with a negative electric charge, and phosphate can also be mined out of the ground. The major purpose of mining it is for the production of agricultural fertilizers. That probably sounds familiar by now. So, what you see in this image on the left here is a phosphate mine in Morocco. Morocco is a small country on the northwest African coast. And based on the most up to date data from the US Geological Survey, Morocco and its politically disputed territory of the Western Sahara are home to 72% of the phosphorus reserves in the entire world. That's a huge amount for a small geographic area. And that hyperlocalization of phosphorus is another issue within itself due to geopolitical factors, but the phosphate that is naturally generated through the erosion and weathering of rocks gets absorbed by plants and incorporated into biological molecules. And then, as with the sulfur cycle, nitrogen cycle, carbon cycle, animals acquire their phosphate by eating plants. And when all of the above organisms die, soil decomposers break down their phosphorus containing biomolecules and release the phosphate back into the soil and water, and then phosphate reserves in the soil and water, as well as phosphate fertilizer runoff from agriculture, will also leach into the ocean, leading to sedimentation on the bottom of the ocean and the incorporation of phosphorus into rock formations. And over long periods of geologic time, regions of the ocean floor become uplifted due to tectonic activity, and this can bring those phosphorus reserves to the surface again. But this final process of geological uplift takes millions of years to occur.